When Nolan Pierce pulled out a chair at the end of the banquet table, Chief Executive Vivian Whitmore looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has wandered into a world built without them in mind. In front of the company's largest clients, she coldly asked a server to take away his knife and fork, and she said the table belonged only to people who had earned a place at it. Nolan did not argue. He simply stood, carried his water glass to the empty table near the window, and sat down alone. A few seconds later, one client rose, then a second, then a third. If you enjoy stories where arrogance finally pays the full price it owes, subscribe to the channel and watch Nolan turn this entire board around. I want to begin 4 days before that dinner, in a place none of the executives ever visited, because that is where the truth of this story actually lives. It was 4:20 in the morning at the Whitmore Meridian Logistics Distribution Center on the east edge of the county, and the loading bays were lit that hard white that makes everyone look tired even when they are not. I could see Nolan Pierce already there in a gray jacket with a coffee going cold beside a keyboard, sitting on an overturned crate because every chair in the shift office was taken. A routing table had corrupted overnight, and 11 pallets of temperature-sensitive medical supplies, bound for Sloan Medical Distribution, were about to be pushed into the wrong trailer lane. Nobody upstairs knew. Nobody upstairs would ever know, which was exactly how Nolan preferred to solve things. What struck me most was what he did not do. He did not raise his voice, did not demand to know whose badge had touched the system last, did not open a laptop to begin drafting the kind of memo that turns a mistake into a career injury for somebody with 3 kids and a mortgage. He asked the night supervisor, a young man named Dale Rusk, to walk him through the last 8 hours the way you would walk a friend through a bad dream. Then he traced the error backward, one handoff at a time, until he found a scanner firmware update that had quietly changed how zone codes were read. He fixed the sort logic himself, tested it twice, and stayed to watch the first corrected trailer roll out at 6:05. Then he thanked every person on that floor by name. At 7:15, his phone buzzed with a message from his 16-year-old daughter, and I watched his whole face change in a way no meeting had ever managed. Sadie wanted to know whether he would be home for dinner because she had learned to ask instead of assume, and he typed that he would try and then studied those 2 words a long moment before sending them. That was the entire shape of his life after his wife died 6 years earlier. Fix the thing quietly, drive home before the food goes cold, and keep the 2 halves from taking bites out of each other. Now let me move you across town to the 30th floor, because the same morning was unfolding very differently there. Vivian Whitmore had taken over as chief executive of her family's company 11 weeks earlier, and she had spent most of those weeks changing what the company looked like rather than what it did. The reception furniture was gone, replaced with pale stone and low leather that no one could comfortably sit in. There was a new dress code, a new photographer on retainer, an image consultant who used the phrase executive presence the way a doctor uses a diagnosis. She had grown up inside old money, been educated at schools whose names function as passwords, and spent 9 years in investment work where the product was a story, and the story was always told in a room with good acoustics. That afternoon, Nolan sat at the far end of the long table and delivered a warning nobody wanted. 3 strategic contracts were coming up for renewal within the same 90-day window, together representing close to half of the company's strategic revenue. And all 3 clients had recently begun asking questions that clients only ask when they are quietly building an exit. He had the specifics, the delivery variance numbers, the 2 service failures that had been smoothed over rather than solved. He got about 4 minutes before Vivian set down her pen. She told him she needed strategy from her leadership, not operational detail. Nolan answered, evenly and without heat, that the operational detail was the only reason those 3 clients had not already left. I watched something harden in her expression because he had not been rude, and rudeness would have been easier to punish. Then her assistant stepped in with the kind of news that changes a room's temperature. All 3 clients had confirmed attendance at the renewal dinner on Thursday. Graham Keaton, Chief Operating Officer of Keaton National Foods. Rebecca Sloan, President of Sloan Medical Distribution. Elliot Hargrove, Chief Executive of Hargrove Retail Group. Vivian allowed herself a small, satisfied breath, and then she read the 3 confirmations more carefully, and the satisfaction drained out of her face. Each email, written independently, ended with the same line. Please make sure Nolan Pierce will be there. The next morning, she asked her chief of staff why 3 of the most powerful clients in the portfolio were requesting a director. And Andrea Colt explained that Nolan had worked those accounts directly for years, that he was the first call whenever something went sideways, and that Graham Keaton had once refused a corrective action plan until Nolan personally signed it. Andrea thought she was describing an asset. Because here is how the information landed in her mind. Not as evidence that a talented person had built something rare, but as proof that her company had allowed a mid-level employee to accumulate leverage that properly belonged to the executive suite. She had spent 11 weeks trying to convince the market that Whitmore Meridian was a premium enterprise brand rather than a regional trucking outfit with a family name, and now she was being told that half of her strategic revenue was held in place by a man who ate lunch out of a paper bag in a break room. Instead of curiosity, she felt embarrassment. Instead of asking what he knew, she began looking for a way to reduce how much he mattered. That decision, made in under a minute and never written down, cost her everything that followed. She settled on a compromise that felt clever to her and looked cruel to anyone watching from the outside. Nolan would attend the dinner because the clients had asked, and refusing outright would raise questions she could not answer. But he would attend as technical support, available in the room in case someone raised an operational question that her polished new vice presidents could not field. Andrea asked, gently, whether the clients might notice that distinction. Vivian said that clients notice what they are shown. She was correct about that in a way she could not yet imagine. Thursday came, and I watched the 2 arrivals at the hotel the way you would watch 2 different films spliced together. The executive team came in a line of black cars, the men in new charcoal, the women in the exact shade of navy the image consultant had recommended. Everyone holding their phone at chest height as though it were a small official document. Nolan came from the distribution center, where he had spent the day walking a corrective process with Dale Rusk's crew, and he changed in the parking structure with the door of his Ford propped open. His suit was clean, pressed, and 11 years old. He had polished his own shoes that morning at the kitchen table, while Sadie complained about a calculus teacher. In the reception area, Vivian observed him from across a marble floor, and every single thing she saw confirmed a conclusion she had already reached. Nolan spoke with the banquet captain for a while about the room layout, using her name, asking about her evening. When a young server dropped a folder of printed seating cards, Nolan crouched and gathered them before anyone else moved. He carried no leather portfolio, only a slim folded packet of notes in his inside pocket. To Vivian, this was a man with no presence, a man who instinctively took the lower position in every interaction, a man who would be invisible beside Elliot Hargrove. To me, it was a man who had spent 17 years learning that the person holding the door usually knows more about the building than the person walking through it. 20 minutes before the clients arrived, Vivian reviewed the seating chart at the entrance to the private dining room. Client relations had placed Nolan at the main table, second seat from the center, and had written a short note in the margin explaining that all 3 clients had requested his presence. She read the note. She read his name. Then she took the pen from the podium, drew a single line through Nolan Pierce and wrote a different name in the space. And because the universe has a sense of timing that no writer would dare invent, Nolan came around the corner at that exact moment with 2 glasses of water in his hands, one of which he had brought for Andrea. He stopped. He did not perform surprise, and he did not pretend he had seen nothing. Vivienne straightened, entirely unembarrassed, and told him not to misunderstand a company invitation. She said that a client wanting him in the room did not mean he belonged at the leadership table. Nolan set 1 glass down on the podium and asked her, without any edge in his voice at all, where she would like him to sit. She gestured toward a small round table near the kitchen door, the kind hotels keep for overflow, and she said, "At the place that suits better." 4 executives stood within easy hearing. Every one of them found something fascinating to look at. That is the moment I want you to hold on to, because it contains no shouting and no insult you could quote in a complaint. Nolan had done nothing wrong. He had spent the previous night keeping a client's medicine moving, and the previous 17 years keeping accounts from bleeding out, and he was being moved to a table near a kitchen door because a woman had decided his title was too small for the good china. There is a particular kind of anger that has nowhere to go, and it was sitting in that hallway with him. What Nolan did with it told me more about him than any performance review ever could. He picked up his water, said that if that was the decision of the chief executive, he would sit where he was asked, and he walked to the small table by the window and set his glass down. He did not tell her about the routing table. He did not mention that Rebecca Sloane's Tuesday shipment existed because he had sat on a crate until 6 in the morning. He did not say a single word that a person keeping score would have said. He took out his folded notes, laid them flat, and reviewed the delivery variance figures for all 3 accounts one more time, because whatever chair he was given, he intended to be useful from it. And then the doors at the far end of the room opened, and Graham Keaton walked in 11 minutes early, as he had done at every meeting for 30 years. Vivienne moved toward him with her hand already extended and her introduction already assembled. But Graham was not looking at her. He was scanning the room the way a man scans an airport for a familiar face, over her shoulder, past the leadership table, and he found what he was looking for at a small round table beside the window. Graham crossed the entire room to reach Nolan, and he shook his hand with both of his own, which is a thing men of that generation do only for people they actually mean. He asked immediately about the Ohio consolidation, the one they had fought through together 2 winters earlier, and whether the second dock had finally been reconfigured the way Nolan had drawn it on a napkin at a truck stop. Nolan said it had, and that the dwell time was down by 19 minutes on average. Graham laughed, a short bark of real pleasure, and said that 19 minutes across 400 loads a week was the only sentence he had heard all month worth writing down. Vivienne arrived beside them and inserted herself into the conversation with a remark about strategic alignment, and Graham gave her the polite half-nod men give to a waiter refilling water. Rebecca Sloane arrived next and greeted Nolan before the chief executive of the company she was there to negotiate with. Elliot Hargrove came last, the most powerful person in that room by any measure you care to use, and he stopped at Nolan's table to say it was good to see the man who had saved him from a very bad quarter. Vivienne stood 3 feet away holding a glass she had not drunk from, and I watched the arithmetic happen behind her eyes. The employee she had just moved to the overflow table was receiving more genuine warmth in 90 seconds than she had earned in 11 weeks. The room was called to dinner at 7:30. Here is where a small administrative failure became a large public one, and I want to be precise about it, because it matters that Nolan did nothing sly. The banquet staff had printed the seating cards that afternoon before Vivienne's pen touched the chart, and nobody had communicated the change to the floor. So when the guests moved to the main table, Nolan's name was still sitting on a small folded card at the second seat from the center. He looked at it, and he made the reasonable assumption that a person makes when a card with their name is placed at a chair. He assumed the matter had been reconsidered. He pulled the chair out and sat down. Vivian saw it from 4 seats away. She had a dozen graceful options available to her in that instant, and I counted them all. She could have said nothing and let the evening go well. She could have caught Andrea's eye and had the card quietly removed later. She could have leaned in and spoken 6 words to Nolan that no one else would hear. Instead, she chose the version that would be witnessed, because she had decided that the problem was not where Nolan sat, but that everyone in the room seemed to believe he mattered, and a belief like that has to be corrected publicly to be corrected at all. She raised one hand and summoned a server, and the room, which had been full of the ordinary noise of 11 people finding their places, began to quiet in that awful ripple that spreads when people sense something is about to happen. She asked the young man to remove the place setting in front of Mr. Pierce. The server hesitated, glanced at Nolan, and then, because he was 23 years old and needed the job, he reached in and lifted the knife, the fork, the folded napkin, and the plate. The sound of silverware being collected in a silent dining room is one of the loudest sounds I know. She was intelligent, quick with numbers, ruthless in the useful way when a negotiation stalled, and her single flaw was that she read a person's worth off an organizational chart, the way a price is read off a tag. Then Vivian looked directly at Nolan and spoke at a volume calibrated for the whole table. She said she thought she had been clear, and that this table was for people who make decisions. Nolan did not answer. He sat very still with his hands resting on the tablecloth where his plate had been, and he let her finish, because he had already understood that anything he said would be used as the reason she had done it. Vivienne, encouraged by the silence, added the line she would remember for the rest of her career. She said that he executed decisions, and that those were 2 completely different jobs. 2 of her vice presidents examined their laps. Andrea Colt closed her eyes for a moment. Graham Keaton set down the roll he had just picked up, and Nolan Pierce stood, unhurried, and pushed his chair back in so that it sat square against the table. Because leaving a chair crooked bothered him. He did not defend himself. He did not list a single one of the 17 years, the 4 rescued accounts, the weekend he slept in a warehouse office, the night he had spent on a crate 3 days earlier so that the woman 2 seats down would receive her medicine on schedule. He picked up his water glass and walked to the small table by the window and sat facing the room, and he even offered the server a quiet apology for the trouble. Vivian felt the way people feel when they have restored order, which is to say she felt lighter and slightly generous. She sat, arranged her napkin, and turned to Graham Keaton with a warm smile, and she said that now they could begin. Graham did not open his menu. He was looking at the empty chair beside him, at the bare stretch of tablecloth where a place setting had been 30 seconds earlier, and he asked whether Nolan was not eating with them. Vivian explained, in the pleasant tone reserved for explaining obvious things, that Mr. Pierce was there as part of the support team. Graham considered that for a moment. Then he laid the menu flat on the table, put both hands on the arms of his chair, and stood up. The room did not understand yet. Vivian certainly did not. She began to ask whether something was wrong with his seat, and I could hear in her voice that she genuinely believed the problem might be a draft. Graham Keaton, who had run distribution networks for 31 years and had fired more people than most of that room had ever managed, spoke without any anger at all, which is what made it unbearable. He said that if Nolan was the support team, then tonight he would like to sit with the support team. Then he picked up his glass and his napkin, walked the length of that beautiful room, and sat down across from Nolan at the small round table by the window. For perhaps 4 seconds nothing happened. Vivian's mouth was open around the beginning of a sentence she never finished. Then Rebecca Sloan pushed back her chair, and the sound it made on the floor was the sound of a door closing somewhere in the building of Vivian's career. Rebecca did not leave immediately. She stood behind her chair with her hands folded, looked down the table at the chief executive, and asked whether Vivian knew what Nolan Pierce had done for her company. Vivian opened her hand slightly, the gesture of a person reaching for a fact that is not there. She did not have an answer because she had never once asked the question. Rebecca let the silence sit exactly long enough. Then she said quietly that she thought that was the problem, and she picked up her menu and carried it across the room. Nolan half rose as she approached, and I saw him say something to her, and I know what it was because I watched his mouth. He asked her to go back. He was not enjoying this. He was a man watching a renewal worth tens of millions of dollars come apart in a hotel dining room and calculating, honestly, how many jobs at the distribution center were attached to that number. Rebecca Sloan sat down anyway and told him to stop being ridiculous. That left Elliot Hargrove, and Elliot took his time, because men in his position have learned that the last person to move is the one everybody remembers. Vivian turned to him with something close to desperation dressed as protocol, and she said that this was a dinner for executive leadership. It was the wrong sentence, and she chose it because it was the only sentence she had. Elliot folded his napkin into a neat rectangle and set it beside his untouched bread plate. He said that this was exactly the reason he would be sitting with the man who provided leadership on the night his company needed it. Then he stood and walked and sat. 3 chairs at the main table. 3 of the most important clients in the company's history, all of them at a small round table near a window, all of them talking with a man whose knife and fork had just been carried away in front of them. Nobody shouted. Nobody insulted Vivian Whitmore. Not one person said anything that could be repeated as an outrage, and that is precisely what made it devastating, because there was no villain to be angry at, and no accident to blame. There was only a room that had quietly and unanimously decided where the actual center of gravity was. She sat down at the head of a 14-foot table with 3 empty chairs on her right, straightened her cutlery, and asked a server for wine in a voice that did not entirely work. Her chief financial officer studied the ceiling molding, and a new vice president named Perry Vance began typing on his phone under the table for no reason at all. At the small table, Nolan tried once more to fix it, which tells you everything. He said that the renewal conversation should happen where the chief executive was sitting, and that he was happy to answer any question from where he was. Graham Keaton looked at him for a long moment and then said no, and then he said why. And the room could hear it because the room had gone very quiet. 11 months earlier, at 2 in the morning, Keaton National Foods had lost its warehouse management system across 4 states with 60 trailers loaded and moving. Graham had called his account team, and he had called 2 vice presidents, and nobody called back. Nolan called him. Nolan had been awake because an alert had fired on his own phone at 1:40, and he was already halfway to the distribution center. Rebecca Sloan added her piece without being asked. 2 winters before, a hard freeze took out temperature monitoring in her primary regional warehouse and threatened the insulin supply for roughly 90 pharmacies. Nolan arrived at 9 on a Friday night, did not leave until Sunday afternoon, rebuilt the routing by hand, slept 4 hours on a folding cot, and never submitted an hour of overtime. She said she had sent a formal letter of commendation about it and asked mildly whether anyone had ever read it. Elliot Hargrove spoke last and shortest. 9 months earlier, Nolan had noticed a 2% discrepancy between physical counts and system inventory across Hargrove Retail's southeastern network, a variance small enough that every automated report had classified it as noise. He drove to 3 facilities on his own time, found a scanning process error, and documented it. Elliot said that if that discrepancy had run another 2 quarters, it would have surfaced in an audit as roughly $4 million of phantom inventory during a period when his company was refinancing. He said that he did not know what a support team was, but he knew what that was, and it was not support. Nolan told none of these stories, and that is the part I need you to sit with. Every fact that landed on that table came out of a client's mouth, offered freely by people with every reason to stay discreet inside a negotiation, and twice he tried to steer them back to renewal terms and was talked over. No promotion or framed award anywhere carries the weight of 3 competitors independently telling the same story about you in a room where it costs them something. 30 feet away, Vivian Whitmore heard all of it because the room was quiet and the acoustics were excellent, which the image consultant had specifically praised. I watched the first genuine crack open in her. It was not remorse yet, nothing so clean. It was the vertigo a person feels when they discover that a fact they had treated as furniture is actually load-bearing. She had spent 11 weeks presenting a strategy to a board of directors, and somewhere in the last 4 minutes, she had begun to wonder whose work she had been presenting. But pride does not surrender in one evening. Halfway through the second course, Vivian pushed back her chair, picked up her glass, and started across the floor toward the small table, with a bright social expression assembled on her face, ready to join the conversation as though nothing had occurred. Graham Keaton did not stand and did not look up from his notes. He said perfectly pleasantly that they were discussing business with Nolan. It was her own sentence, returned to her with the packaging still on. She stood there for a moment, holding a glass of wine in the middle of a room she owned, and then she went back to her chair. The evening ended early. No contracts were discussed in any binding way, no terms were agreed, and the executive team filed out with the specific silence of people who have witnessed something they will describe accurately only years later. In the lobby, Elliot Hargrove put a hand on Nolan's shoulder and said, in a completely normal voice, that they needed to talk tomorrow before anything got signed. Nolan said he would make himself available, and Vivian Whitmore, standing 6 feet behind them with her coat over her arm, heard every word of it. At 9:40 the next morning, Nolan was called to the 30th floor. He had been at the distribution center since 6, and he came up in the same gray jacket, and he sat down across from a woman who had spent the night constructing an interpretation of events in which she was the injured party. There was no apology. I want to be exact. There was not even the shape of one. Vivian began by saying that she had been reflecting on a serious governance concern, and that concern was that a single employee had developed personal relationships with strategic clients to a degree that now interfered with executive authority. Nolan listened all the way to the end without interrupting, which unsettled her more than an argument would have. Then he asked one question. He asked what she believed he had said to them. Vivian started a sentence about patterns of influence and did not finish it, because there was no finish available. He had not called those 3 clients. He had not asked anyone to leave a table. He had asked Rebecca Sloan to go back to her seat twice, and he had told Graham Keaton the renewal conversation belonged at the main table, and there were 9 witnesses to both. What she was accusing him of was being trusted. She could not win the argument, so she reached for the thing she still controlled. She informed him that he would not be attending the renewal meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, and that Perry Vance would present the account strategy in his place. It was an act of pure position, the corporate equivalent of moving a knife and fork, and she watched his face for the reaction she needed. If he raised his voice, she would have a documented incident. If he refused, she would have insubordination. If he pleaded, she would have leverage. Nolan asked whether she would put the decision in writing. I have rarely seen a question do so much damage with so little force. Vivian said of course, because saying no would have admitted what the request implied, and 40 minutes later the email existed, time-stamped, unambiguous, naming her as the person removing Nolan Pierce from the 3 renewal accounts effective immediately. Nolan saved it. Then he spent the rest of the morning doing something that infuriated her far more than defiance would have. He assembled the complete account files, the variance histories, the open corrective actions, the personal notes on how each client preferred to be communicated with, and he walked Perry Vance through all of it for 2.5 hours in a small conference room. That evening at home there was a plate of pasta and a daughter who did not miss much. Sadie asked him what was wrong, because his voice had gone quiet in the particular way it did when something at work had gone past annoying and into something else. Nolan did not give her the story, and he did not lie to her either. He said that sometimes a person has to decide whether they are going to keep sitting in a place where they are not respected. Sadie thought about it and said that when she had told him something like that about her chemistry class, he had made her write down what she would need in order to stay. He looked at his daughter for a while and then said that was probably fair. The next morning before 6, Nolan opened a document he had not touched in 9 years and updated his resume. He did it without drama and without telling anyone, and when he was finished he saved it and closed the laptop and drove to the distribution center to walk the corrective process with Dale Rusk's crew, because the work was still the work. Across town, Vivian rehearsed her presentation twice in front of the image consultant, and the deck was genuinely beautiful, with a market positioning narrative that would have played extremely well at a conference. She believed, in the end, that clients need vendors more than vendors need clients, and that a bad dinner is a bad dinner. At 2 o'clock, all 3 clients arrived in the lobby at the same time, on time, together. None of them walked toward the conference room. They stood at the reception desk in their coats, and Graham Keaton leaned on the counter and asked the receptionist a single question, loudly enough to carry down the corridor. He asked where Nolan Pierce was. Vivian came out to meet them herself, which took courage of a sort, and she did it with a smile and an outstretched hand, and the announcement that her team was fully prepared. She told them Nolan would not be joining, that the account leadership had been consolidated at the executive level. Rebecca Sloan asked whether he had resigned. Vivian said no. Rebecca asked, then, why he was not in the building's conference room at that moment, and Vivian gave the answer she had rehearsed, that this was an executive-level meeting. I felt the temperature of that lobby drop by 10 degrees. Elliot Hargrove had come in carrying the physical renewal packet, 400 pages in a black portfolio. Because he was old-fashioned about signatures, he set it down on the reception counter, and he did not pick it back up. He said that they would not be meeting today. Vivian, still working from the theory that this was emotional, said that she understood the dinner had been awkward and that she hoped they would not let one uncomfortable evening derail a partnership of many years. Elliot looked at her with something that was almost kindness, which was worse than contempt. He told her the dinner had not caused anything. The dinner had simply shown them that she did not understand her own business. Then Rebecca Sloan asked whether Vivian had read the renewal agreements. Not the summary, the agreements. Vivian said she had reviewed the terms, which was true in the way that reviewing a house means looking at the front. Rebecca opened Elliot's portfolio, turned to a tabbed page near the back, and put her finger on a clause under a heading that Vivian had never once thought about. Key personnel continuity. All 3 contracts had one. All 3 had been drafted with one for the same reason. The clause was plain. It named specific individuals as designated strategic leads on the account, required written notification before any of those individuals were removed or reassigned, and gave the client the right to review and withhold acceptance of a replacement. Nolan Pierce was named in all 3, And here is the part I find most beautiful about it. Nolan had not put himself there. He had not negotiated it, had not asked for it, and in 2 of the 3 cases had actively suggested that naming an individual was unnecessary, and that the company should be accountable rather than a person. The clients had insisted, separately, over a period of 5 years, after learning what happened to their accounts when he was not the one holding them. Vivian read the paragraph twice. She had signed one of those renewals herself, 8 weeks earlier, as part of a bridge extension. She had read the annual value, the margin structure, the term length, and the executive summary slide her deal team had prepared. And she had put her signature on page 1 of a document whose page 311 she had never opened. That email she had sent so confidently the previous morning, the one Nolan had politely asked her to put in writing, was now a written record of a unilateral removal of a named key person from 3 contracts, with no notification and no client acceptance. Graham Keaton watched her arrive at that understanding and did not gloat, which I respected. He did say one thing, and it was the sentence that reframed the entire story. He said that they did not request Nolan because they liked him, although they did. They requested Nolan because when something went wrong at 2 in the morning, he knew what to do, and knowing what to do is the only asset in logistics that cannot be bought at the last minute. Then he suggested, with the mildness of a man who knows he holds every card, that Vivian might want to invite Mr. Pierce to the building. Nolan came up from the distribution center in the gray jacket with a smear of grease on one cuff, and he walked into that conference room without a single visible trace of triumph. He did not look at Vivian. He greeted the clients, apologized for his sleeve, sat down, and asked what they needed. What followed was 90 minutes that I would recommend to anyone who has ever confused a title with an ability. Rebecca asked about the cold chain exception handling for her new specialty line. Perry Vance began an answer about process excellence frameworks and stopped after 11 words. Nolan gave her the specific temperature threshold, the 2 facilities that could not currently support it, the cost of retrofitting one, and his recommendation to route through the other for 6 months instead. Graham asked about a surcharge that had appeared on 3 invoices in April, and Nolan said it had been applied in error, and that Keaton was owed roughly $14,000, which he had flagged internally in May and nobody had acted on. Elliot asked what would happen to his southeastern network if the port strike everyone was watching landed in September, and Nolan described a contingency he had already built, with 2 alternate lanes and a named backup carrier. Question after question, the gap widened between the people holding titles and the person holding the knowledge. At the end, Rebecca Sloan closed her folder and did not sign. She said that before her company renewed anything, they needed to know one thing, and she looked directly at Vivian Whitmore when she said it. She asked whether Whitmore Meridian intended to keep Nolan Pierce. Vivian went back to her office and did something she should have done 11 weeks earlier. She asked her chief financial officer for the complete account history on every file Nolan Pierce had ever touched, and she told him not to summarize it. What came back was 240 pages, and she read all of it, alone from 4 in the afternoon until nearly midnight, with the city going dark outside a window she had recently had reglazed. She found the recovery plan that had saved the Keaton relationship after a distribution failure in the 2nd year of the contract, drafted by Nolan, presented to the client by a senior vice president who no longer worked there. She found the exception handling redesign that had cut Sloan Medical's late deliveries by 61% over 4 quarters, with his name on the internal draft and a different name on the client-facing version. She found the inventory variance investigation for Hargrove Retail, filed as a routine operational note, that had prevented a $4 million misstatement. She found 3 formal letters of commendation from 3 separate clients, all addressed to leadership, all acknowledged with a form response, none of which had ever generated so much as a note in his file. And she found a declined promotion from 4 years earlier, a regional role requiring roughly 60% travel, with a one-line reason: family circumstances. Then she found the thing that stopped her cold, because it was in her own materials. 3 of the 7 achievements in the operational excellence section of the presentation she had delivered to the board in her second week, the one that established her credibility with her own family, originated in work done by Nolan's team, attributed to a department name so broad it functioned as fog. He had reviewed that deck for accuracy at her deal team's request, corrected 2 figures, and said nothing about the line describing his own weekend in a warehouse as a leadership initiative. I watched her sit with that at 11:40 at night, and I will tell you what she finally understood, because she said it out loud to an empty office. It was not that Nolan Pierce had been too small to notice. It was that she had never once looked down far enough to see who was holding the whole thing upright. Everybody knew him. The banquet captain knew him. Dale Rusk on the night shift knew him. 3 of the most powerful clients in the region knew him well enough to stand up in a hotel dining room for him. The only person in the building who had not known was the one who had decided she was above needing to. But this story is not going to hand her an easy absolution, and I would not report it honestly if it did. At 8 o'clock the next morning, before she could construct any gesture, Nolan's resignation arrived in her inbox. It was 4 sentences long. It thanked the company for 17 years, gave 4 weeks of notice, offered a full transition plan for all accounts, and stated that the trust between him and the leadership of the company was no longer present. There was no accusation in it anywhere. It was the calmest document I have ever seen do that much damage. She called him in, and for the first time, she was the one talking quickly. She offered a substantial increase in compensation. He declined. She offered a retention bonus, then an accelerated equity grant, then the promotion to vice president that should have happened 4 years earlier, and he declined each one in the same unhurried voice, not enjoying it, not punishing her, simply answering. Finally, she stopped and put her hands flat on the desk and asked him what he wanted. Nolan thought about it for a moment, and then he said that he wanted nobody in that company to have to earn a large enough title before they got treated like a human being. Vivian had no answer for that at all, and the silence went on long enough for both of them to hear it. 3 hours later, the board of directors called an emergency session. It was not because a director of client operations had resigned, although that was in the packet. It was because all 3 clients had sent the same formal notice within 90 minutes of each other. And no board on earth reads 3 identical letters from half its strategic revenue and calls it a coincidence. The letters did not demand that Vivian Whitmore be fired, and I think that restraint is what gave them their force. Powerful people rarely need to ask for a head. They simply describe a condition and let the institution do the arithmetic. What the 3 clients wrote was that renewal discussions would remain suspended until Whitmore Meridian could demonstrate that its operations leadership had a genuine and structural role in decisions that directly affected client accounts. That was all. No names, no incident, no mention of a dinner. A governance requirement phrased so cleanly that it could be entered into minutes without embarrassment and satisfied only by actual change. The chair, a 71-year-old cousin of Vivian's father named Walter Whitmore, asked whether anyone present could name the person handling those 3 accounts, and 2 of the 9 could. They invited Nolan into the room at 4 in the afternoon. He came in the same jacket. He had not prepared remarks, and he was not there to testify against anyone. And when Walter Whitmore invited him to describe what had happened at the dinner, Nolan gave the shortest factual account possible and declined to characterize the chief executive's motives. Then the board asked him the real question, which was what it would take for him to stay. He did not ask for an office, a car, a seat on any committee, or a single thing that could be described as revenge. He asked for 4 things, and he had written them on one sheet of paper. That client operations hold a standing seat in strategic planning meetings, not by invitation but by right. That the person who directly manages an account be heard before leadership makes any commitment to that client. That internal reporting credit the team that produced the result, by name. And that title never again be used as a reason to exclude someone from a room where their knowledge is needed. Walter Whitmore read the sheet twice and then passed it to his left in silence. The board approved all 4 within the hour and added a 5th of their own. Nolan Pierce was offered the position of Senior Vice President of Client Operations, which was not a reward and not a promotion so much as a correction, a title finally matching a job he had already been performing for the better part of a decade. He asked for one day to think about it, went home, and asked his 16-year-old daughter what she thought, and Sadie asked whether the new job meant he would be gone more. He said no less, and she said then obviously yes, and went back to her calculus. Vivian Whitmore remained chief executive, and I want to explain why that is the more satisfying ending. Her unilateral authority to restructure client-facing teams was suspended and placed under board oversight for 18 months. Her leadership bonus for the year was moved into review, given that 3 strategic contracts representing close to half of strategic revenue had come within days of walking out the door. She was required to present, personally, a quarterly report on client operations integration to a board that now knew exactly what questions to ask. She kept her office and her family name and lost the thing she had valued most, which was the assumption that her judgment did not require checking. The 3 clients resumed renewal discussions within 2 weeks, and all 3 signed before the end of the quarter, at terms slightly better for Whitmore Meridian than the previous cycle. They did not sign because a chief executive had been humbled, and nobody in this story ever took a victory lap. They signed because a company had finally repaired the thing that had made them doubt it, and because the man they trusted was still there, and because trust, once it has been demonstrated rather than promised, is the cheapest thing a business can run on, and the most expensive to replace. 5 months later, on a cold evening in November, Whitmore Meridian held another dinner in the same hotel, in the same private room with the excellent acoustics. On the seating chart at the entrance, Nolan Pierce was placed immediately to the right of the chief executive, and this time nobody had drawn a line through anything. He arrived from the distribution center as usual, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with a plate in his hand, looking at the room. At a long table at the back, near the same kitchen door, sat 9 people from operations and dispatch, and the night shift, including Dale Rusk in a borrowed tie, invited for the first time and sitting very upright the way people do when they are not sure they belong. Nolan looked at his own name card gleaming beside the chief executive's. Then he carried his plate to the back of the room and sat down with them, and asked Dale how the second shift was holding up. Vivian Whitmore came in 10 minutes later, and I watched her see the empty chair at her right hand, and then find him at the back table with his sleeves pushed up, laughing at something a dispatcher had said. It was the opening scene of this story turned exactly inside out. The same room, the same 2 tables, the same distance between them, and only one thing changed. This time she did not issue an instruction. She picked up her glass, crossed the entire length of that beautiful room in front of every executive she employed, and stopped beside the table by the kitchen door. She asked whether there was room. Nolan looked at the empty chair beside him, and he did not make a speech, and he did not make her wait longer than a heartbeat, because he had never been interested in punishment. He pulled the chair out. Vivian sat down among the operations team and asked Dale Rusk what his name was, and then she asked him what he did, and then she listened to the answer. Across the room, Graham Keaton watched all of it over the rim of his glass and smiled to himself, and said nothing to anyone. Nolan Pierce never needed to win a seat at the table where the powerful people sit. He needed the powerful people to finally understand why he had always belonged there. And the difference between those two things is the difference between ambition and worth. Some people spend a career arranging the chairs. A very few spend it holding up the floor.